the natural biological activity in the soil, manufactures antibiotics like streptomycin, which naturally prevent the diseases and those types of things. You have just killed out all the sources for these beneficial things. So now basically on year 4, you actually have a hydroponic lawn because all that soil is doing is holding the plant, and you're putting on chemicals to feed it.
Let's make this happen. Jim, thank you for coming.
Great to be here.
I appreciate you. I was introduced to Zamzows when I had moved here. We have a lawn, not a huge lawn, but we have a lawn, and I like my lawn. And somebody said, well, automatically you got to go down to Zamzows and pick up their, 3-stage fertilizer. Like, I'm used to just trash Scott's for just the scourge of the earth and just poisoning everything except my grass. So when I started finding out a little bit more about your fertilizer, I really, really not just like the function of the product, but I like what the product is actually doing on a larger scale. Talk to me about that.
Okay. Well, let me give you some history. So years ago, I became a technical consultant for the largest lawn fertilizer company in the country. I won't name names because I don't want to be disparaged. After I had been consulting through our stores for about 4 years, one of my very favorite customers, and we called them pet customers, and the reason that we did that is because they would come in and stand in line. They would either wait for my brother or myself or one of our employees because they trusted what we had to say, and they didn't want to listen to anybody else. So this one customer of mine came in, and he said, Jim, would you come look at my lawn? I said, well, it's kind of busy this morning. It's Saturday morning, but nothing much happens until 10 o'clock. Okay, I'll run over and look at it.
You actually went to his house?
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we do lawn calls even to this day. So I went to his house, and he said, now look at my lawn. Well, I was taught to diagnose all of these problems, and I got down in the grass, and I found the insects that I could identify, and I found all the diseases that I knew and all the problems that go along with the average lawn in this area if it hasn't been treated properly. And he said, so what should I do? And I said, well, you need to start in the spring program with the crabgrass control and the fertilizer, and then you need to use this weed killer plus fertilizer, and then you need to use the insecticide plus fertilizer, and in the fall you need the fungicide plus fertilizer. And that'll take care of your problems. He said, I'm not buying it anymore. I said, why? And he said, how long have I been with you? I've been on this program for over 4 years. And he said, look at my neighbor's lawn. Well, his neighbors, no fence between their lawns. The only reason you could tell there was a difference was because he mowed his lawn right up to the point where his neighbor didn't. He said, look at my neighbor. He doesn't have all these problems. Not a perfect lawn, but it's healthier than mine. He said he goes to the farm and gets a bunch of manure and puts on in the fall, and it stinks, and he sprinkles it in, and in 3 or 4 days it's gone. And he said, his lawn's doing pretty good when you compare it to what I'm spending on mine. And he said, why? And I said, well, the dogs and cats and stuff going across from your lawn to his, he's going to get the same thing. He's going to catch that disease, and he's going to get all these insects. And he said, Jim, I'm not buying it. And I said, well, spores from fungus, they just will fly over from here over to his lawn. And he's shaking his head. And I'm saying, gosh. So I get back and I call my teacher back east. And I tell him the story. He said, well, you need, just like I just said, you need to put on the crabgrass preventer plus fertilizer in the spring. And I said, no, I've got to go deeper than this because I'm not buying it anymore either. I couldn't get any information from him. I called a very prominent turf expert at Michigan State, North Carolina State. I talked to these guys. They all give me the same thing. Well, you need to use these. If you get fungus, you got to use these fungicides. Well, I was in a quandary because I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what was right. And then my accountant said, I just had a guy here move from the Midwest, and he was a big ag guy in the Midwest, and he's retired here. And I think you'd like to meet him. So I sat down with him. His name was C.J. Fenzow. He started a company called Acres USA along with another guy years before, which they called it ecological agriculture. And I told him what my problems are. And he said, I can explain to you if you have the patience to listen to me. And I said, man, I'm ready. And he said, okay, well, in this area where you start off with about 3% humus in your soil or organics in your soil, everything works pretty good. You put on one application of a chemical fertilizer, usually it's high in nitrogen, which is what makes the foliage grow. And he said, man, it pops. It looks beautiful. And he said the second year you put it on again and it still works pretty good. And the third year you might have a little bit of problem around the edges. And then the fourth year you're having to use chemical fertilizer, pesticides. You have to use all these things, more weed killers. Crabgrass is coming in, so you have to use more crabgrass preventer, all of this types of stuff. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. But why? And he said, every time you put on a unit of nitrogen or a pound of nitrogen fertilizer, you burn out 12 to 20 pounds of carbon, which is the humus in the soil, which is what holds water, which stimulates the biological activity in the soil. The natural biological activity in the soil manufactures antibiotics like streptomycin, which naturally prevent the diseases and those types of things. You have just killed out all the sources for these beneficial things. So now basically on year 4, you actually have a hydroponic lawn because all that soil is doing is holding the plant, and you're putting on chemicals to feed it, and they wash through the soil, and then your soil becomes unhealthy, and therefore all these bad things move in. Now, so in a nutshell, I sat there with this man all day long.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
We're in a restaurant downtown. They had to run us out of there because I sat at this man's feet. And I had him for 5 years before he passed away. And it completely changed the way I was raised. All of my education was conventional. Dad had the chemical farm products, the chemical fertilizers, all of those things. Even back in the day when we had ammonium nitrate, and we had to keep our sulfur separate from our ammonium nitrate for fear we would cause an explosion in the fertilizer shed, to going back to something more natural. Now, I'll admittedly, being a product of the 60s and 70s, I went clear the other direction to the organic. I didn't want to have anything to do with chemicals or chemical fertilizers at all. But then since I realized you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, there's a marriage there. There's not anything wrong with the use of chemical fertilizers as long as they're used prudently. It's the overuse of these materials that has caused us our problems. And then, of course, we get into genetic modifications of our crops and some of the pesticides, and each one of those we could talk about for a day, and never get clear to the core of it. That was the start. So I realized I've got to create a fertilizer that makes the grass green and makes the soil healthy and get that soil into the cycle of life rather than putting it into the cycle of death. And so I had to figure out, I had to take the best from both worlds. I had to learn what I learned about carbon, and also how I learned about the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then all the traces that go along with it. How do I marry that together into a product that'll actually make the soil get better and better every year instead of worse and worse every year? So that was the start of our lawn service, our lawn product. The interesting thing about how we made the product was I was teaching a little class on composting up in Sunnyside, Washington, to a bunch of orchardists, trying to teach them not to waste, when they make apple juice, don't throw all that stuff to the dump, but actually compost it and put it back on your farm and so on. And at the end of this lecture, and by this time I'm probably in my early 30s, I had an old guy come up to me and he said, son, I like your concept. He said, I have a small dairy and I have a small orchard. And he said, I'd never feed anything to my apple trees that I wouldn't feed to my cows. And I thought about that for a little bit. Well, Dad at the time was the biggest dairy feed manufacturing in southern Idaho, in Meridian. And I thought, well, I have all these ingredients that go into dairy feed. I'm going to see if I can make a fertilizer out of dairy feed ingredients. So we used to say, so safe even a cow can eat it, but the Department of Ag said, you can't say that. So we don't. But the truth is, the paunch of a cow, or the first stomach of the cow, is basically a big fermentation chamber, which digests all this grass and stuff that it eats to produce milk. Well, the soil is just the paunch of the plant. It's a biological decomposition process in the soil that releases nutrients to the plant, and that makes the plant healthy. It's a pretty basic concept. I mean, anybody that practices organic farming or gardening, or regenerative, as we now call it, are doing this very thing. It's just that I had the resources to make the natural fertilizers that were safe. We felt safe for kids and pets and the environment, which they are. And of course, I'm challenged with that. And they say, by safe for kids and pets, what do you mean by that?
Right.
And well, if a kid goes out and eats a pound of your fertilizers, no, of course not. But it's by having a kid play on the grass after we put our fertilizer down is not harmful to him. Others can't say that. In fact, they are harmful in a lot of cases, depending on what they put down. And then we have these skin irritations, skin diseases, sinus, eyes, problems like that some of the products that we put on the soil can cause these problems. So I've always gone to the direction of what we're putting down. Number one, has to be safe. Number two, it has to work. I mean, when people put our products down, they want a green lawn. They could care less about what goes in there. And only about 10% of the people truthfully care whether or not it's got anything harmful in it or not, because they don't believe those things can be harmful. After all, the Department of Ag says they're okay, and the FDA says they're okay, and therefore they must be okay. Well, in my career, which is going on almost 60 years now, I've seen literally hundreds of chemicals that have been registered by the EPA to use on the soil have been realized that they're carcinogenic, and so therefore they've been pulled off the market. And clear back, starting with DDT back in the early 70s, clear up through chlordane and lindane and just about every other chemical that you can think of have been taken off the market. Why? Because they're poisonous. As my son likes to say, when you put something on that's supposed to kill something, it kills something. It doesn't necessarily kill the target that you put on. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with these products because we have to use them. They're just another tool in the toolbox, but we don't want to use them if we don't have to. And if we can get our soils right and we can get everything functioning properly, we don't have to use these chemicals. Now, in Big Ag, it's a little different. In Big Ag, most farmers right now, if they don't have the profit of parity, in other words, if they put on $500 worth of product on their farm, they better get $600 back, because most farms can't stand a loss of profit for 1 year. They'll lose their farm because either the bank is going to get it or somebody. I mean, we've seen this in the Midwest. That's why most of the farm ground out there are owned by the billionaires or the big banks out of Chicago. They loan the money on the farm can't pay them, they take the land. And that's just kind of how it rolls.
Right.
So let's get back to the lawn. So most people really don't care what we have in our products. Some do, but most don't. Most say, boy, thank you for your lawn program. It really works. It makes my lawn green. It's the happiest it's ever been. They don't say, what's your relationship with your iron to copper in that formula, you know? That's really, there's a few. I mean, you know, the microbiologists at Boise State, they'd like to know what that is, you know? And really, I'm the first one to tell them. I don't think you can keep your light under a basket. I think we have a responsibility to teach people these things if we can. And I've had people say, well, you know, why would you want to help me? I'm your competition. I go, no, you're not my competition. You are promoting good health and good soil and good practices. You know, we're in this together. So do you make a little money on your product that maybe I would have made if I had the business? Well, maybe. But trust me, we're the little guy on the block. You know, I was having dinner after a lawsuit that I'd been involved in over another issue. I was with my lawyer, and we decided to go because we happened to be successful, and we went to Ruth's Chris, and we were having a nice steak. And my lawyer said, "Oh, there is such and such a man that I had known many years before, who is responsible for a very large chemical fertilizer." And I said, well, I haven't seen him since I was a boy, about 17. I'm going to go over and say hello. And my lawyer said, you know, he hates your guts. I said, what? He said, yeah. You know, every time you talk about decreasing the amount of use of chemical fertilizers and try to get the soil healthy and all this kind of stuff, he just seethes. And I said, well, you know, I'm nothing compared to his wealth. And I said, oh, that's strange. Well, I went over to say hello anyway, and I over and shook his hand and said, you know, I don't know if you remember me, but when we were boys, our dads had similar businesses, and yeah, he remembered me. He was kind to me, wasn't rude. I didn't feel like he hated my guts. But the point is, I'm doing stuff that rubs some people raw. You know, it's like talking to someone about high cholesterol and taking my approach to high cholesterol, which is, I don't believe cholesterol has anything to do with heart attacks, based on my background and my research.
And just sorry to interject, to that point, I apparently have very high cholesterol, and people tell me with proper food and proper diet and exercise, I can decrease that. Like, you know, I could actually run a marathon right now, and like my body mass index is quite low. Like, I eat very, very well. Yeah, I agree with you.
There's no correlation. There's as many heart attacks that take place based on what I read with low cholesterol as there are with high cholesterol.
Right.
It's cholesterol is just an indicator of the inflammation that's in the body. It's not it doesn't have anything to do anyway. So
yeah,
you know,
we're not going to fix heart disease today.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
We better bring a heart surgeon in to
right.
talk about this. But the point is, when you say that, and you've got a cardiologist that's recommending these things right and left because they truly believe that you need to get this stuff down, and most MDs believe that, you're rubbing them the wrong way. And that doesn't turn out so good when the largest part of the population believes that you need one of these types of drugs to lower cholesterol. For me, the fewer drugs you can take, the better off you are. And if none is the level that you're looking for, which is the way I look at it, because I'm not I think the body can take care of itself, and I'm more of a naturalist. Now, I've gone all the way from one side to the other when it comes to these types of things. But since I'm not an MD and I'm not qualified to speak on these issues,
Sure.
then I won't, right?
Right. Last time I went in for a checkup a few years ago. I'm not a hypochondriac. I don't worry about it very much, similar to you. And my doctor at the time, this old Russian guy, is like, "How old are you?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm 39, sir." And he's like, "Any medications?" I said, "No, I don't take anything." He's like, "Oh, we could fix that." It's just cracked me every time I would tell people, like, "Yeah, no, I don't." They're like, "Not even for heartburn or something?" Like, "No, I don't have heartburn. What would I have to eat to get heartburn?" And it's anyway. So I'm very in line
Most
with that
doctors, though,
mode.
if when you go in, so what medications are you on? Well, I don't take anything, and they say, good for you. And it doesn't matter if it's the doc in the box or whoever it is. They say, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good, because really, it's like they fix one thing and create another problem. The contraindications of drugs always have a downside. We fix one problem, but we create another problem.
Right.
When the body is perfectly capable of correcting these problems for itself, given the right environment, the right terrain, as Louis Pasteur said on his deathbed. He says, it's not about the microbe. It's all about the terrain.
So looking at what you've done with just the average consumer's lawn, your capacity to bring back health, your ability to produce higher quality, visible outcome, right? I took an environmental science class when I was at Cal, and it turned into one of my favorite classes. It was just a random class that I had to fill out, my general ed. So I take this class, and they had the best guest speaker I had ever heard. This guy comes in, starts telling us about how he goes down to like Nicaragua or something, or wherever he might be, a third world country, and he was dealing with these very, very poor farmers, and he was going through all of these problems that they had. Look, when you planted a stalk of corn, you'd maybe get like one ear of corn, right? That's correct, yeah. A ear. What do you call it?
You get one ear on a stalk.
Yeah.
But you could get two very readily, and you can't get even more than that.
Right. So he was getting these very, very small payouts, and the corn itself was having a difficult time growing. They also were out of firewood, which I had not considered. He said, "Look, I mean, you have people that literally burn wood to heat their houses or cook their food. Firewood's important, and they had taken all these trees out to make farmland." It was a huge problem. He said, "Okay, what's happening here?" So he goes to the farmers and asks them, like, what's the deal? And they said, the earth is very tired. Like, okay, thank you, but we need to figure out. So they figure out, ultimately, they're like, all right, look, they're lacking nitrogen, they're lacking a bunch of different things. But this is not an area in the world that could participate in standard, industrialized farming practices. They don't have these giant tractors that are shooting nitrogen and whatnot into the soil. They don't have access to these, mass fertilizers and things of that. So what this individual did, the scientist said, all right, look, we need to find a tree, right? So they found a tree that grew extremely fast, and its roots ran down to the soil really quickly, and it sucked out a lot of the gases, nitrogen and whatnot from the atmosphere and deposited those in its roots. So they found these trees. They started planting them in the off season like crazy. And at the end of the season, what they would do is they would cut the trees down, and then some of them they would grind up and shoot back out into the fields. And then some of them, all of a sudden, we had firewood, right? Because they were growing trees. And then when they started growing their corn started getting, 2, 3, 4 ears of corn, and much larger. And the yield was considerably better. And then all of a sudden, people had actual fuel for their, heating and cooking purposes.
Fantastic.
From there, they went on, they said, okay, look, if we have an actual solution to fix our soil, why are we growing corn, right? Because this is something that is very easy to grow. It's very cheap, and we're not going to get the same return out of our healthy soil growing corn versus growing kale or growing spinach. So they started switching up, because they had now this nutritious soil, they started switching up what they were actually growing in their fields and in their farms. Because they started getting more money from the different types of products that they were growing, the little micro economies developed, like nurseries and things of this nature. Different, supporting industries around the earth. But it was all because he fixed, he was able to find a functional way that didn't involve just paying out to large corporations for these chemicals. He found a way that he could find a loop that improved the soil and the lives of the individuals around, and then that improved the functionality, the utility of the actual ground.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. It was, I remember listening, I mean, obviously I was 19. It stuck with me the entire time. It blew my mind that there's such a criticism, especially in California, of like the crazy environmentalist. But here was somebody who very much believed in the environment, but from a functional, pragmatic stance, which is, hey, if we don't fix the environment we're interacting with, if we don't fix the soil, we're all dead.
Yeah. It's not a political thing. Fixing the soil is to benefit all of us. And like I always say, whether we're left or right, we're still all Americans. And that's what we should be focusing on first. What I'm going to guess that your environmentalist came up with was what we call a leguminous tree, a tree that fixes nitrogen on its root system. We do that a lot with some of our crops, like alfalfa and clover and some of those type things, to rejuvenate the soil. He solved several problems by getting the wood and so on by that. We now have isolated and are providing what we call nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. They're naturally occurring, but if we give them the proper nutrients, the atmosphere is a huge part nitrogen. It's how do we get that nitrogen back into the soil? Well, it requires a plant with its inoculant, if you will, the bacteria that's on the roots of a leguminous plant, to be able to pull nitrogen out of the air. But now that we've isolated bacteria that can do that without
the actual tree,
the synergism of the tree, so that's a lot of what we're doing. So we're providing natural nitrogen that comes out of the atmosphere into the soil. I've consulted some third world countries on how to grow crops and how to properly nourish their soils and so on. And in Peru in particular, we have a very similar situation. I'm working with a guy that they raise corn primarily up on the side of the hill. A lot of what they're missing up there because of the high rainfall area is the trace minerals. Well, they're just a few miles from the ocean. So I've taught them how to harvest seawater and then use it in a proper form, dilute it and actually ferment it using some other processes to feed these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They can actually apply this seawater extract onto their ground and do very similar to what the tree did for your friend.
Wait, back up. There's a method of taking seawater, fermenting it, and treating it in a specific way that produces a fuel for nitrogen-producing bacteria.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but also for the plant. I mean, think about it. The seawater contains all of the nutrients that originally were on the land. Okay, so through rainfall and irrigation and so on, these end up in the Mississippi River or the Columbia River, and they end up out in the ocean. So the seawater contains all of those. It is very high in sodium. That's the one downside to it. But when it's properly treated, we can bring that back on to the ground and feed our plants. It actually becomes, it's not a magic pill here. It's very practical. If we can figure out how to get those things and get them back up on the ground where they originally were, we can grow good crops. Okay? Big Ag doesn't want people to know anything about these types of things. It gets into the profitability of their companies. So we can teach poor countries. I had one, I think the country was in Africa, a friend that had came to me, and they were helping an orphanage there. And he said, can you help us to figure out how to get some nutrients on their crops? And I said, yeah, they have cattle. Yeah, they do have cattle. They don't butcher their cattle, but they tap them for blood,
Sure. Yeah.
and the types of things that the natives do. And I said, okay, well, get yourself a tank, and I'll teach you how to put some of that manure in with some of the local foliage. I'll teach you how to ferment that into a tank and how to use it on their crops. He calls back and he said, Jim, they don't even have tanks. I said, well, don't they have something like a stock tank or something? He said, no. I said, holy cow. I mean, we're really talking poverty here. Yeah. I said, can you get some plastic tarps like visqueen or something that won't leak water? He said, yeah. And I said, then dig some holes in the ground and line those holes with these tarps. And I'll teach you how to ferment these materials, the manure and the plants from around there, and how to make a soup that will make a good fertilizer for their crops. But we had to go clear down to the fact that they didn't even have a stock tank or a plastic. I said, do you have any plastic barrels? No, they have nothing. So, but it works. And they started having success in growing their crops. And they just needed a little leg up. They need to be taught how to do these things. You don't have to ship a bunch of chemical fertilizer, granular, over there in order to enable these people to grow crops, which in turn is going to ruin their soil. You know,
there's an ancient wisdom to soil manipulation that goes way back even into the Amazon, right? That's the famous case of the it's terra firma, or no, it's
terra preta.
Terra preta. Mm-hmm. The super rich black soil that they engineered to grow. And there's the argument that the Amazon is predominantly a man-made rainforest that produces all kinds of, like the Brazil nut, right? Like people planted those trees initially. Yeah. What that particular knowledge was lost over the ages. Do you think that most cultures, that have existed have figured out a way to do the things you're talking about in the absence of obviously industrialized farming? So it was like thousands of years ago, people were figuring out ways to make soups and fertilizers and whatnot. And we've just kind of lost that knowledge over the decades.
Yeah. My grandmother is a perfect example of that. So I graduate from college and I know everything now. And I go to my grandmother, who's...
You're the 22-year-old genius. Yeah. You got it.
I go to my grandmother. And I said, Grandma, we need to put some 16-16-16 fertilizer on your garden. It'll make it grow better. And she said, James, you stay out of my garden. I said, Grandma, look, I learned some stuff. I know. And you didn't ever go to college. And she said, let me tell you a story. She said, we used to have the farm over here. That was at the corner of Cole Road and Franklin Road, where that mobile, I think there's a church there now, but there used to be where all the automobiles were sold in the valley. They farmed that ground. She said, we never used any kind of a fertilizer except for what she called it manure. And they piled up their manure. They had 40 acres there. They had cow manure and pigs and everything. They had, and there was a self-sustaining farm. Even their sugar came from the bees that they had. And she said she went and got a picture of Grandpa standing on a hay wagon with his shovel, and the corn was clear up on the shovel. And she said that's the kind of corn we used to raise. She said after World War II. All these chemical fertilizers came out, and all of our neighbors started using them. But she said we came out of the Depression in poverty, so we couldn't afford to buy anything, even if we would have wanted it. But she said we always had better crops than our neighbors, and all of a sudden our neighbors started having corn earworm and corn borer and things like that. And she said, I don't know, honey, but I think it had to do with that fertilizer they were putting on their ground. This is the wisdom of a 90-year-old woman. Grandma lived to be almost 105. Wow. And she wouldn't so much as take an aspirin. So, little things like that you learn as you go along. She put her coffee grounds out around her plants. She never wasted a peeling or anything like that didn't go in the compost pile, and then went on to the garden. So, yeah. She was German heritage. They had been growing good crops in Germany for lots of centuries before we started using chemical fertilizers on them. So, but the truth is, if you take ground that is reasonably good productive, and you go out and you put on a strip of chemical fertilizer on it, you will just about double the yield that first year. That's how the chemical companies got the farmers to all do it. After World War II, you see what happened was we had all of these things that were used to make gunpowder.
Sure.
And, we had potassium nitrate and sulfur and carbon. We put them all together and we make gunpowder. Well, when the war was over, they have all of these big facilities that are making these things, but they don't have anything to do with it. Anhydrous ammonia is a classic example. Anhydrous ammonia was used to harden the runways in the South Pacific so we could land our big bombers on them. So what did anhydrous ammonia do? It flushed the carbon and the calcium out of the soil so it would set up like concrete. Well, after the war, we used anhydrous ammonia, which is a very cheap form of nitrogen fertilizer. We knifed that into the soil to get our crops to grow, but guess what? It made our ground set up like concrete just the same as it did the runways down south. So all of these were byproducts of the war. We had to,
we had hammers, we needed to find nails.
Exactly, that's right. So, though, I kind of get off track a little bit.
So in the first year, you're going to double your payload.
So what happened after the war? The chemical fertilizer companies would go to the farmer and they would say, could I just load up my truck and go out and make one strip across your grain field? And then you can see if this stuff works for you or not. So, of course, what happens? You've got one swath where that sprayer went that just grows up just the same as your lawn does if you put chemical fertilizer on it for the first year. Oh my gosh, it's gorgeous. It grows beautifully. It just grows maybe a little bit too fast, but it still does. And so you're hooked. Oh my gosh, I'm going to put that on my whole farm. I doubled my yield on that one strip. And that works pretty well for years, depending on the quality of the soil at the time. If you go up into our Palouse area, there's all this beautiful alluvial soil that moved down with the last ice age. It takes a lot of years to ruin 30 feet of good soil, but you can get her ruined. You just keep doing it and you can ruin it. Why do you think in the early days people migrated west? It's because they depleted their soils. They'd move to new ground and they'd farm that. And then they would move out further west. You can't mine your soils and take all the things out of the soil and never replace anything. It's just a matter of fact.
So where do we go then with the industrial farming complex and these large scale agricultural chemical producers? Because it sounds like, what you're talking about is, okay, look, you developed a fertilizer for lawns that was based on the idea that if you get the soil healthy, you'll get good byproducts from that soil. You'll have fewer fungicide issues, fungus issues. You'll have fewer insect issues. You'll have fewer all of these things. But that was the springboard to you becoming a soil expert and helping people recognize that there are different ways of protecting and, in fact, reinvigorating the soils that we all depend on just to stay alive, be that a third world country or the United States.
So you're saying, where do we go from here?
That's right. Because what you're doing, which, again, I understand the things you're saying, it's not what people are told they should be doing. And I think the pendulum is swinging back with people really starting to question larger, established, accepted wisdoms in all kinds of fields. And the agricultural field, I think that's true as well. There are all kinds of films and documentaries that are done by, the likes of Michael Pollan and other agricultural critics and commenters. But it's still difficult for people to understand that it's the soil health, and fixing soil health is not an impossible thing.
Right.
For instance, I get discouraged sometimes, or have in the past, when somebody says, they're like, hey, look, monocrop cultivation depletes something like 50 years worth of nutrient accumulation in the soil. And here I got little kids and I'm just thinking like, oh my God, are we the last generation of humans? Like, is this going to be the land before time when all of the, like we don't have any more food? And, the Tyrannosaurus Rex is coming out to get us. I get worried about this, but it sounds like that's the wrong perspective, which is, hey, stop being defeatist and recognize that there are functional solutions to our soil problems if we just take a step in that direction.
Okay, so I mean, there's a long description that I could give you about this, but in a word, carbon. Okay, I told you at the start, we continue to put on chemical nitrogen fertilizer, which in turn burns out the carbon. The microbe in the soil will keep your carbon to nitrogen ratio imbalance in the soil if you let it. Okay, but if you keep putting nitrogen on, and if you burn out 12 to 20 pounds of carbon every time you put on a pound of nitrogen, pretty soon you have no carbon in the soil. Carbon is what feeds the microbial activity in the soil, which in turn, all these microbes manufacture a myriad of things. But one of the things that they do is they manufacture what we call a mucilaginous substance, basically a snotty substance, which is what holds the soil together, flocculates the soil. That is what holds the water in the soil, so that when it rains, the soil can store the water instead of letting it run right straight through and into the Columbia River. Okay, when we burn the carbon out of the soil, we're now farming hydroponically. Now there are a lot of ways to get carbon back into the soil. You can do it by tilling your straw back in after you harvest instead of selling the straw off. You can put carbonaceous material on the ground. Guys, we were for years manufacturing what we call humic acid and extracts of a leonardite or a carbonaceous type deposit in the ground. We can bring in all kinds of things like seaweed and the tree that you're talking about, put the sawdust on the ground. Those are all carbon. Eventually, they will balance out in the soil. But the answer to big ag is, let's at least get some carbon in there with your nitrogen and balance that back out a little bit. Then we got a good start. We can go a lot further than that. I've formulated products. My newest product, I actually call it chicken soup for the soil. People say, what does that have? Chicken manure in it? No, does that have chicken feathers in it? No.
Did you not get the reference? Come on, man.
So people say, why would you call it chicken soup for the soil? I said, because
my God,
it makes the soil respond, a sick soil respond, like a child will respond if he's sick to chicken soup. Grandma used to tell us, you don't feel good, you're sick? Let me fix you up some chicken soup broth. That'll bring you right around, which it does. There's a lot of things in that broth that are healthy for you. So without telling everybody, well, it's got all of this carbon and it's got all this seaweed mineral and it's got all this kind of stuff, this is going to make your soil feel better. And that's really all people want. When they buy our lawn program, they don't come in and want to know what the chemistry is. They want to know, does this make my lawn green? Is it safe for my kids? And does it actually make my soil better? Those are the three things that they want to ask about our lawn program. Yes, yes, and yes. Now, if you need to know more about it, our people are qualified to tell you all about it and teach you how to do it and everything. People, you can teach them how to do it themselves, but the truth of the matter is nobody's got any time to do it themselves anyway. Even the 10% of the people that would love to have our lawn program, they don't have time to do it themselves. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're legislators. They don't have time to be putting stuff on their lawn. So 10% of the people that can't even buy our product because they don't have any way to put it on. They have to hire somebody else to do that, which I'm working on that also. So, but so there, that's the story. We can go off on any shoot, any direction that you want. But we can reference that seawater thing all over again.
I think the thing that's most important from out of all of this is, I think a lot of times when people bring large scale systemic problems to the table, they say like, we have to change the face of, everything. And when I asked you that, you just said, well, look, keep doing what you're doing. for now, let's just get a little carbon in there. Like, let's just start small thing. Don't change your equipment. Don't change your means of production. Don't do any of that. Just add in this little piece, and that'll be a good start. And then we can kind of start going in that direction. That's so practical. It's almost laughable. Like, it's so clear that, okay, great. So I can keep using the same equipment. I can keep getting similar yields. I can keep doing all this. The cost most likely would be justified by potentially increase in yields or decrease in dependence on either pesticides or fungicides or other chemicals.
Well, you can't afford to increase their costs. If you go to any large farmer and you ask them who has their money, they will say, well, the fertilizer company, the tractor company, the petrol dealer, the guy that sells me the diesel, the pre-emergent control for the soil, the chemicals that go on the soil. And at the end of the day, does even a drop of profit come out into your farm? In many cases, no. As I always like to say, in the end, the farmer always gets it in the end. Well, they don't have to. They do not have to be totally reliant on all of these people supplying them chemicals and fertilizers. They can go to a regenerative type of farming. We can help them. We always say, don't ever increase the cost of your input. Let's decrease the cost of your input. I just came back from Maui. Just spent time with the Maui Gold Pineapple Company. We can decrease their inputs. We can improve their soil just by taking a portion of their chemical fertilizer and putting it into a product like chicken soup for the soil or a carbonaceous type material. We can start getting their soil healthy again. We can start decreasing their inputs, not decreasing their yields, maybe even increasing the quality of their product. And all of a sudden, more money is dropping to the bottom line of the farm. And that's what we got to do. If we want to keep our small farms going, that's the only thing that's going to help them survive. There is a termination in this chemical farming. And the termination is all of these degenerative diseases, cancer and diabetes, and I can just name them on and on and on. They all are a byproduct of poor nutrition, because our crops no longer have the nutrient value to them, and B, the toxicity that we are contributing to them. We as an organism have to eliminate this stuff as it goes into our body. We already autolyze material in our cells, which the body has to eliminate. We create our own toxicity. And if we're healthy, if we're not innervated, we can eliminate all these natural toxins. But then we start adding toxins from the air, from the water, and from the environment in general. Then our reservoir becomes too full of toxins. And if we can't eliminate those start manifesting as diseases in the body. You know anybody that has or has died recently of cancer?
I do have family members who have had it, yeah.
Well, I can ask that question to just about anybody, unless it's some kid in grade school. Of course.
Right.
It's rampant. Those are not just the canary in the coal mine. We should wake up as a public and realize, my goodness, we are poisoning ourselves. We've got to do some things besides just worrying about what software we're going to use on our computers. I've always said, someday those computers aren't going to taste very good. We gotta be focusing on the farm. We got to be focusing on the soil. We've got to be doing environmentally correct things. And that doesn't throw anybody out of the game. It doesn't throw the chemical fertilizers and the pesticide peoples out of the game. It's like we've got a great big toolbox. And we've got all of these things are tools, and we use them as necessary. But we don't want to just lean on them like a crutch. We've got to get our soils right and get them functioning properly. And therefore, we can decrease the use of these inputs. We can decrease the costs to our farms. we can improve our health, and look at the reproductive capacity of our nation right now. Our women are losing the ability to reproduce. Our men are losing the ability.
Right.
So there's answers to that.
Yeah.
And most of them are pretty natural answers.
Well, Jim, listen, you've been telling me all kinds of stuff. I so appreciate you. I'm really happy that I moved in the area and met you and am able to take advantage of the products that you make. It's something that I've been worried about for a long time, well before I moved here. And again, every time I would be reminded of it, it was just kind of this defeatist experience, which is, God, man, like we're in for it. But you've actually given me a little hope. As horrifying as parts of this conversation were, I'm like, okay, maybe there's a chance. So thank you for coming in today. Thank you for explaining all of this. I really hope first of many, because I have a lot of questions, but I think they're going to be longer conversations. So I don't want to bore you to death and get you to start talking another hour here. But
another day, as my wife would say, another day. But at my age, my goal right now is to teach as much as possible. And I searched for a long time before C.J. Fenzow came into my life and showed me a better way. And if we can get people interested and make them understand, and it doesn't matter who they are, if they're farmers, if they're people that have lawn services, or if they can learn something from this and make the world a better place because of something that they learned today, then we've done something good. And
that's fantastic.
That's what we want to do.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for coming in. First of many. We'll do it again.
Okay.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.